Very much indeed, Shirel. Can I say that the pint glass is as much a surprise to me as it is to all of you. Those of you who can put your cameras on, please do. It's lovely to see your faces when I speak. It makes it certainly feels more interactive. Um, can I start with a groveling, abject apology? Somebody last week lured me in and I fell straight into the trap. Somebody asked a question in chat about Christian Zionists. They said, I think the question was something along the lines of, did Christian Zionists help in the founding of the State of Israel? And I just had a minute or two left at the end of the time last week. And I said, oh, I can just finish, I can just answer this quickly. No, they didn't. And furthermore, and it was an appallingly insensitive, oversimplified, inaccurate, and offensive response. So I want to apologize for that. Those of you who kindly don't remember anything I said last week will not remember that, but some of you may. And not least, it may be true that there are some Christians on this call, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are, that they consider themselves Zionists as well, and therefore they are Christian Zionists by definition. And I would have been unwittingly offensive to them. So I just want to take a moment to clarify. The question asking about Christian Zionists was asking something about organized Christian Zionists as opposed to individual Christians who feel warmly towards and care about and support Jews in the State of Israel. That, to my mind, is a Christian Zionist, as it were, lowercase c, lowercase z. But the Christian Zionists as a political force didn't exist as a formal organization or any kind of formal group. Or a position that was taken back in the day of the founding of the State of Israel. It simply wasn't there. However, all of you will be aware that nowadays there is a powerful, potent, and especially in America, one might even say mostly in America, but certainly, especially in America, very powerful political lobby of Christian Zionists. And that's capital C, capital Z. Translate, Christian Zionists. And I said last week that these guys just want Jews in Israel so we can all be smashed up in Armageddon and the end of days will come. And I just want to be clear that theologically, the organized, dynamic, powerful Christian Zionist lobby, and I'm not talking then about each individual member of it, because I'm sure there's variety amongst them, but as a lobby, its desire is to press for the maximum occupation of Jews in the land of Israel in order to precipitate the end of days. This is not caring about Jews on the surface of it. It is using Jews for a further theological end. And the consequence to Jews could be in the short-term political or in the long-term eschatological categorically disastrous, but that's not the point. And therefore, Christian Zionists as a formal political organization do not spend time thinking what is the best outcome for the Jews in this matter? Would it be better to compromise or negotiate or whatever it might be? Each of you will have your own opinions on whether one should compromise or negotiate or something. That's your business. But the Christian Zionist lobby stands very firmly for an inflexible position in order to force the issue. And we are, of course, so grateful for people who sound like allies that we're rather unsubtle when we consider the formal, structured Christian Zionist lobby. I want to stress that is not talking about individual Christians who care about Israel passionately and are interested in it. That's a very, very different thing. And forgive me, last week, I just kind of bundled it all together into a single thing. And I'm sure too that in America, especially, there are subsets and divergences within the Christian Zionist movement. So you may be able to point to someone or other or some church around the corner to you where you don't think that is the case. And you may well be right. But taken overall, the Christian Zionist movement is not thinking what's best for the Jews right now. They're thinking about how do we force this issue forward, and that's not always helpful. Okay, so folks, we left it last week really kind of on the cusp of the creation of the State of Israel. And as you know, the State of Israel came into being in 1948. The British pulled out, basically leaving effectively a power vacuum, but more to the point, leaving two communities that had been informally, but categorically at each other's throats for the last couple of decades, at least, and perhaps a little bit longer. And Jews and Arabs, and we use the word Arabs at this point, Jews and Arabs had been slugging it out informally, locally. Both sides had committed, I think, what any objective person would call atrocities in relation to the other side. Both sides had also attacked the British in the process as well. And when Britain pulled out, Israel immediately declared independence. And interestingly enough, even at the 11th hour, at the moment, and by the way, this was a Friday afternoon, so they had to get it done and dusted by the time Shabbat came in. And that was announced in an auditorium in Tel Aviv. Nobody was thinking of Jerusalem as the kind of key city in which to make such an announcement. Jerusalem was extremely vulnerable. And anyway, you may recall last week in the United Nations partition plan, Jerusalem was not going to be part of the Jewish state. It was going to be a freestanding, international, United Nations administered enclave. So Tel Aviv was clearly going to be the sort of capital city of this new country. They all got together. There was lots of haggling about the Declaration of Independence and so on and so forth. Much discussion about whether God should be mentioned or not. Remember, a very significant proportion of the early Zionists were at the very least secular, in some cases rabid atheists, and therefore the idea of mentioning God was an anathema to them. At the same time, of course, the other side, the religious side, felt it was an anathema to not mention God. So they finally compromised with a reference to commitment to or faith in the Rock of Israel. So that kind of left it vague as to what we were talking about. So one side could believe they meant one thing and the other side could believe they meant something else. But when it came to the declaration of the state, Ben-Gurion, who was doing the declaring, kind of went into the hall without final conclusion as to what he was going to call it. Folks, it's really worth thinking about because this course is called Making Sense of Israel. Right. And in 1948, Ben-Gurion went into that hall thinking, I'm going to call it Israel. Right. And that's what he did. I'm sure half the people listening expected him to call it Judea or Judah or Yehuda or something like that. There may have been other names. I don't know which other names might have been in prospect. I wouldn't be surprised if Sion had been a candidate for it. Otherwise, why are they Zionists? I mean, why call it Zionists unless it's people committed to Zion? But nevertheless, Ben-Gurion declared it and called the state shall be called the State of Israel. Prior to that, it's worth remembering that in British times, the territory was called Palestine, but in Hebrew, it was called Palestine Aleph Yud, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Aleph Yud, Eretz Yisrael. So that was Jews kind of putting a marker on saying this is a Jewish land. And they took the biblical term Eretz Yisrael. But it was not a given that this would be the name of the state until Ben-Gurion announced it. Well, and as soon as the announcement was made, I think this is indisputable. That doesn't mean to say that it's not disputed, but it is indisputable that as soon as Israel declared independence, the surrounding Arab states invaded. Now, they were not on their own in doing this, so let's be clear. The resident Arabs in Palestine also wished to fight the nascent Jewish state. They did not want a Jewish state in the territory. They did not accept the partition plan in any way, whereas it is probably true that the Jews thought, we'll take what we're given, and if we can push the boundaries a little bit, all well and good. Straighten things out, tidy things up. You remember the partition plan that we saw last week, really, really difficult thing to police. I am sure that privately there were a lot of people thinking, if all goes well, we can kind of tidy this up a little bit. I don't think they expected to get the whole of the mandate land of Palestine east of the Jordan, sorry, west of the Jordan. But nevertheless, probably they thought they could sort out some of the borders. And that is, of course, what they did. By 1948, the borders had been, to some degree, straightened out. Israel had retained thrust into Jerusalem, but could only hold West Jerusalem, the modern bit of the city. The old bit of the city fell into Arab hands, and Jordan held the West Bank, Egypt held Gaza, and Syria held the Golan Heights. Of course, Syria already had the Golan Heights because Britain had handed that over to Syria in the 1920s. This is the armistice lines. These are the armistice lines of 1949, and that's where it sat for 19 years or so. There were continuous skirmishes across the borders. I think it would be true to say that, generally speaking, Israel did not seek these skirmishes. That is, it had no particular ambition to win any territory during those 19 years, but certainly it was determined to hold those borders. Those borders did not have international status, let's be clear. They were an armistice line. They were not official borders. Right? Nobody voted to say these are the official boundaries of the State of Israel, not least because they couldn't say that any of the other boundaries were the official boundaries of anything else. Because nobody wanted to make these the boundaries of, for example, the Kingdom of Jordan, or to make Gaza an official part of Egypt. The Egyptians didn't want to make it an official part of Egypt. So these boundaries were not formally enshrined in international law. So for 19 years, things kind of teetered along reasonably enough. Israel remained a new, poor, precarious state. When I say precarious, I don't necessarily mean in terms of defense. I mean not least in terms of finance. It was a poor country. Anybody who remembers going to Israel in those days, in those 19 years, will remember that one of the first things you had to do was take your own toilet paper. Right? They just they didn't have loo rolls. It was primitive, Israel, and of course it was struggling to absorb huge numbers of refugees. The two big blocks of refugees that came in were, of course, the large number that came from post-Nazi Europe, who had been held back by the British. So a large number of Holocaust survivors and refugees from the Holocaust. And the other large number was a variety of individuals from Middle Eastern Arab countries who had left those countries, in some cases as a result of animosity from their neighbors, and worse than animosity. You would think of the Iraqis, for example, the Farhud and the various attacks on Iraqi Jews, which led them to evacuate Iraq. In other cases, and that also was true, tensions rising in places like Morocco or Egypt or wherever, Jews leaving those places, not necessarily or not usually expelled, but their lives becoming less and less secure, them becoming more and more nervous, and leaving to go to Israel, and of course to try and go to other places too. They didn't only want to go to Israel, and then a proportion going ideologically. One thinks in particularly of Yemenite Jews who were very excited by the possibility of going to the promised land, as it were, but also others, and that's not dissimilar, but a much larger number than those who went ideologically from the West. Think of Americans who made Aliyah or whatever it might be, not because they were being chased out of America, but because they wanted to engage in this wonderful experiment. So Israel furiously trying to accommodate and absorb these refugees, it almost immediately manifested a pretty racist system. The leaders, should I say, leaders of Israel's politics were Ashkenazim from Europe, Eastern Europe particularly, the Russians and the Poles and so on. And they were socialists or communists. They were certainly on the left of the political spectrum. Not, let's remember, the way in which perhaps a lot of Americans will hear the word socialist or communist, i.e. equivalent to Russian political modes, right? Not that, but ideologically, genuinely, beautiful things, socialism and communism in terms of sharing and inclusion and equality and all of those kinds of things. But a lot of sympathy from a lot of those folk for the Russian Revolution, for Soviet and communist aspirations to make the world communist and so on. The view of the Americans, and let's just mention that because I think we lose this in historical perspective, American leadership was very distrustful of Israel in those early years, very distrustful of it. And it would be wrong to think that America was in any way a useful ally to Israel in those early years. The starkest example of that, of course, was the Suez debacle, which was a post-imperialist adventure on the part of the British and the French in order to try and get the Suez Canal back under colonialist, imperialist European control when Nasser nationalized it and took it over for the Egyptians. But Israel was constrained by France and Britain to play a part in that exercise, not least in order to push the Egyptians back towards the Suez Canal and out of its backyard, effectively. And after the Suez crisis, America made it absolutely clear that it had no intention of helping or engaging in this at all. And that really was the nail in the coffin of the British Empire. That refusal on the part of America to kind of support Britain and France in that exercise left France an implacable opponent of America, furious at not wanting to get involved in NATO, insisting on having its own nuclear deterrent, so on and so forth, not trusting America at all. There's no love lost still between France and America. The British were more conscious of their, historical special relationship and all that kind of stuff. So they didn't feel as implacably opposed, but it did for the British Empire. I mean, the British Empire was already pretty well dead, but the Suez event and America's engagement in that was quite bluntly, and I'm sure it was a deliberate American move, to see off the remaining imperial powers so that America could indeed seize its manifest destiny of world power, which is where it found itself in the 50s, late 50s and 60s. So that Israel would not rely on America as an ally. And America thought anyway that Israel was temperamentally and emotionally more in tune with the USSR. So of course it wouldn't go anywhere near Israel as far as these things are concerned. And by the time we come to the Six-Day War, 1967, Israel is largely dependent on French arms. Israel's airplanes were French airplanes, Mirages, right? Not getting anything from America much. You may remember, even by the time we come to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, there is still some shuttling back and forth on the part of Henry Kissinger and some discussion about whether or not America would resupply arms to Israel and it used its control in that matter in order to twist Israel's arm. America at this point, of course, having decided that it really did need to get a grip on the Middle East, and it started to try to pull Egypt away from the USSR as well. But it's really since the Six-Day War that it would be legitimate to talk about America as a kind of fundamental, utterly reliable ally of Israel. And of course, those of you with reasonable memories will recall too, for example, George Bush Sr. Still confronting Israel over loan guarantees in relation to the sale of arms and the use of, I think, was it rockets or aircraft or something. So it was not not an absolute done deal. We nowadays, when we look back, we kind of think of Israel as America and Israel joined at the hip, but it definitely was not the case. Anyway, you all know and remember, don't you? The Six-Day War took place, and when the dust settled, it became clear that Israel had achieved a stunning victory and had taken over large swathes of land. And pretty well immediately, and this is still under a Labour-led or left-wing government, left-of-centre government, pretty well immediately, the government let it be known that it would cheerfully trade this land it had won for peace. And I think it would probably be true to say that its whole strategy was indeed to secure land so it could trade it for peace. It hoped that the stunning victory and the humiliation, effectively, of the Arab forces roundabout would bring the Arab countries to the peace table. But in actual fact, what happened almost immediately was that the Arab League met in Khartoum, in Sudan, and declared the three no's: no to peace, no to negotiations, and no to recognition of Israel. And so there we were in a stalemate. As you know too, some years later, when finally Sadat from Egypt decided to break rank and seek to make peace, Israel immediately, even though it was under Menachem Begin, a very much more right-wing prime minister, immediately kind of followed through on that initial promise, more or less, which is, if you make peace with us, we'll give you the land back, right? However, of course, the Sinai Peninsula is a very different thing to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, occupied territories, disputed territories, God-given Holy Land, whatever you want to call it. That big chunk of land. Well, big, it's actually very small. In America, it looks like a backyard in Texas, right? It's a tiny place. But nevertheless, that piece of land is a lot harder to negotiate over because it is, of course, that is the core. That is the ancestral Jewish Holy Land. That is the bit of land the Jews held. The Jews didn't care about Tel Aviv or the Negev, or even Beersheba wasn't a big deal. Up around the Golan Heights or the Lebanese border or something, kind of sentimental stuff. Haifa wasn't in the game. None of this. Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the disputed territories, this is the heartland. And not surprisingly, a considerable number of Jews, especially religious Jews, who take the Bible as their guidebook, find it virtually impossible to contemplate negotiating away any of this land. We talk about great cities, Hebron, for example. Why would you want to negotiate away the place where the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people are buried? Isn't that the heartland? Now, of course, as we know, in different parts of the world, people have had to do that sometimes in order to secure peace. But the question is, how desperate are you? So, for example, Kosovo, if any of you remember or know anything about Kosovo in the Balkans, Kosovo is widely understood to be the foundation site, the inspirational core of Serbia. That's where Serbia got going, in Kosovo. But the Kosovans see themselves as more allied to Albanians and more Albanian in culture. They don't want to be Serbian, and they fought a battle to throw the Serbians off. And indeed, the Americans and the British basically supported that process. And so the Serbians have had to, through gritted teeth, had to kind of acquiesce to the fact that Kosovo is to some degree semi-autonomous or independent. Right? Different countries have had to make that kind of concession. Ireland accepted that 6 counties were not going to become part of United Ireland, but they were going to stay Protestant and stay as part of the United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland. Whether these things last or whether you can hold them that way, of course, is a whole long different discussion to go on with. But the need to recognise that an appeal to history is not an appeal to destiny is something that any grown-up person has to do. An appeal to history is a useful contribution to the discussion, but it is not a trump card to silence discussion. And however much the Jews may want to argue that we were here first or anything else like that, that doesn't automatically kind of settle the discussion. Now, somebody's, oh, right, I've just seen Shirelle ask me, do I consider the Jews a people or a religion? Well, folks, you know, they're a family, aren't they? I mean, that's why we argue so much. I quite like the word people because it's so unhelpful. It doesn't mean anything to anybody. It's got no proper meaning. Nobody defines it. It's not got any political status. It's not got any religious status. It's not got any cultural status. It's not properly used in any international law. I love it. It's a great word. But I'm very happy with tribe, clan, people, that sort of thing, big extended family, something along those lines. Is it a religion? Categorically not. Does the Jewish people have a religion? Yes, of course. Does everybody care about it? Absolutely not. Does that disqualify somebody from being a Jew? Definitely not. Right? So no, definitely not a religion. But that we have a religion and our religion teaches us wisdoms, of course, that is true, and it's distinct from the religions of other peoples. That's also true. And I see that Janet Rosenberg said, didn't German reparations play a big role in helping Israel? No. Israel's financial circumstances in those early years, Germany was also struggling. Germany was not in a position to make reparations in the very earliest years of the existence of the State of Israel. Remember the Marshall Plan, right? Germany was not a means for kind of taking money in from America and handing it over to Israel. That didn't happen, right? Germany had to rebuild first. The Marshall Plan was a program by the Americans predominantly to reinforce Germany, rather like they did with Japan as well, in order to try and bolster democratic government in those countries quickly so that they would be strong and they wouldn't succumb to fringe groups seeking to undermine them. So no, German reparations didn't. Of course, in later years, it did. The very earliest arms that came to Germany, oddly enough, to Israel, oddly enough, in the War of Independence, came from Czechoslovakia, little Czechoslovakia, transferred some Second World War stuff over, and some of the heaviest arms that the early Israeli army had came from Czechoslovakia, rather surprisingly. Anyway, so we have a situation where the State of Israel found itself in conflict with what we used to call the Arabs. The Arabs were a pretty squabbling lot amongst themselves, so they weren't a completely unified group by any measure of means. Egypt kept trying to be the leader, and from time to time was more or less successful at this, because the largest and most populous and probably the most prosperous of the Arab countries at that stage. But of course, by the 60s and 70s, the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia were flexing their muscles more insistently. They were figuring out how to make the oil bonanza work for them, and indeed the oil tool or weapon work for them. And there was a thing called, there still is a thing called the Arab League, which theoretically brings together all the Arab states, but sometimes it only serves the purpose of accentuating how divided they are. But somewhere along the way, so the PLO was born in 1964. 1967, Israel was still fighting the Arabs, not the Palestinians, even though the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, existed. And indeed, there were other splinter groups like the Palestine Liberation Front and so forth. And the PLO and other groups were starting to cultivate their reputation as terrorists, first as airplane hijackers and so on. So they were trying to put themselves on the map, trying to become recognized that they were themselves the people. This was not an Arab cause only, it was a Palestinian cause. It was a cause for Palestinian Arabs, and it was about them. You will have seen much dispute around UNRWA, the United Nations Organization for Refugees in from Palestinian lands. This is a unique structure in which the United Nations continues to recognize as refugees people third and fourth generation, that is, people who never were in the land from which they are said to be refugees. That contradicts the Refugee Convention of the United Nations, and it is exceptional. But nevertheless, UNRWA exists, and it is the primary body for providing welfare support, education, and so on and so forth to Palestinian refugees and their descendants all around. So we've heard a lot of UNRWA, about UNRWA recently in Gaza, and the accusation that UNRWA hosted or included Hamas operatives and so forth. Time will tell how significant that is. America ceased its funding of UNRWA. Lots of other countries did at the same time, but I think every other country except America has come back to funding UNRWA. Certainly Britain has. I think other countries have too, except America. And UNRWA provides those kinds of services, medical, educational, and whatnot services, where there are Palestinian refugees and their descendants to be found. So it's very big in Lebanon. It's pretty big in Jordan, certainly in the West Bank, and in Gaza, of course, as I say, is famous now, and in parts of Syria and in other places. So in all those places where Palestinian refugee camps were established, and subsequently, of course, as we know, those refugee camps are not sort of rows of tents. They're frequently significant cities with 5, 6, 8-story buildings in them, but nevertheless still classified as refugee camps. UNRWA is an operative in those places. And many countries have said that if we don't fund UNRWA, especially and not least in Gaza, then there is no coherent way of getting aid to the Palestinians, humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. You can all have your own views as to whether we should get aid or how, or can we trust them, and so on and so forth. UNRWA claims that it's cleaned up its act so that it's more confident that it doesn't have Hamas operatives amongst its staff. But let's be honest, in Gaza, I think it's probably really difficult to not have Hamas operatives in your staff, because I think Hamas is a very widespread organization. A bit like people, probably I have to say Lahavdil, I'm not sure, but a bit like people were part of the Nazi party under Hitler. That is, if you just wanted to get on as a school teacher, you probably do wisely to join the Nazi party, not because you had any ideological intention, but you just wanted to be principal of the school. You were never going to be a principal of a school if you were not a member of the Nazi party. And so I think the same sort of thing goes with Hamas. You're going to fly the flag because that's just the way you might get preference for finding a flat or getting your children into the right institution or whatever it might be. So I think you'll find an awful lot of Hamas associates and operatives and so forth, and Hamas's fingerprints all over pretty well everything that happens in Gaza. I don't think it's necessarily very conclusive about who is and who isn't a genuine supporter of Hamas's stance. Anyway, it was in the 70s, I suppose, that Israel now found itself confronting the Palestinians as opposed to the Arabs. And the Palestinians, the Arab League, said from now on, the Palestinians will represent their own cause. And while we'll support them, they will represent their own cause, and the PLO will be its spokesperson. So, as you know, the Oslo Accords in the 1990s determined that the Palestinian Authority, a body set up under the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority, predominantly led by the PLO, and Fatah, would be the spokesperson, the representative of the Palestinians in any international and Israel-Palestinian discussions, that the Palestinian Authority would be that thing. That was led by Yasser Arafat until he died. Now Mahmoud Abbas is, I think, into the 17th year of his 6-year reign. So that's the Palestinian Authority. And as you may or may not know or remember, the PFLP, for example, a very militant subset of the Palestinian resistance. And I'm carefully here using language. I'm trying not to use language which is immediately judgmental. But the PFLP, a very militant subgroup, was entirely secular. It was a secular freedom fighter movement, right, along the lines of others that you might find in Latin America or places like that. And it also had very great sympathies with sort of communist aligned states and other countries around the world, especially developing countries that were or had thrown off colonial rule, felt themselves very much in sympathy with the Palestinian cause. They read it immediately as being similar. European colonialists occupying and suppressing indigenous peoples. So the PFLP was predominantly secular. You may remember that in the PLO and amongst some of their leading hijackers, Leila Khalid and people like that, there were quite a number of Christians. So a lot of Christian Palestinians, not least because Christians were frequently better educated than Muslim Palestinians. They went to better schools. There were church schools and missionary schools and so forth. So they were frequently better educated. They went to university. They frequently went abroad. They brought back with them messages from Western university campuses about the liberation of peoples and how this should apply or could apply to the Palestinian cause as well. So by the time we're into the 70s and 80s, the Israelis are confronting the Palestinians, who are supported by the Arabs sort of in the background. But by the time we come to the 90s and 2000s, particularly into the 2000s, the story shifts again. And this is very much articulated by people like Hamas, who argue that the battle is actually between Jews and Muslims, that the people that Israel is fighting is Muslims. And at this point, you find countries like Indonesia or Pakistan or whatever thinking that what's going on in Gaza is very much their business, because this is a front line of the Western world. It's a rerun of the Crusades, effectively. The Jews are just a proxy for the European powers. And of course, America is just the European powers writ large, another colonialist Western power, imperialist power. And therefore, this is an existential battle between the Muslims and the Crusaders. And then, therefore, it's every Muslim's business, not just a battle going on in the Middle East. And that's a shift again, a third shift from being against the Arabs, being against the Palestinians, and now being a Muslim fight. And this, of course, is very disconcerting, because we know there's 2 billion Muslims in the world, or 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. That's quite a lot. However, what we also know is that you don't need very many people, nutcase people. I'm using language which is very careful so I don't use any judgments here. You don't need many nutcase people to set the world alight. I mean, how many crazy crazes would you need to make the world go mad? A few 100,000? 10,000? You know, nicely placed in the right place and smash up everything. They could do it. There's 1.5 billion Muslims, and folks, remember, it's not happening. The vast majority of Muslims are not leaping to the barricades and fighting the good fight, or even really mostly seeing it their business, except in a kind of loose, sentimental, and not very examined way. Right? This is my family, these are my people, and therefore I'm on this side. Um, but you only need a few nutters in the United States to decide to attack kind of every synagogue there was, to be able to attack every synagogue there was. Right? It's not happening. That doesn't mean to say, of course, there aren't crazes here and there aren't horrible events happening. But it's really important to not think that we are completely embattled by an utterly mad, billions worth of enemies. It isn't so. Not yet. But as we can see, things can shift. The definition of the battle and the definition of the sides can shift. So I've seen that charity, a question asked at charity from America, did it make a difference early on? We were constantly told that we needed to support Israel. And yes, I think charity did. We were all told that we had to support Israel, and we gave money to Israel. And certainly we improved the social welfare structure of Israel. We built orphanages or hospitals or added to universities or, those kinds of things. So we certainly the money from the diaspora went towards improving the quality of life for Israelis, certainly. But I don't think the Jewish community's contributions went towards the overall bottom line of the state of Israel and enabling it to cope. One of the interesting things with the Oslo Accords, before or around the same time as the Oslo Accords, was a group of Israeli politicians who said, we don't need your money anymore. You need it. Your communities are in stress. Why are you giving us money? Right? We can go. We're doing well enough. Why are you giving us money when you should be spending it on yourselves? How ridiculous that you can't afford to open a Jewish school and instead you're sending money to set up a Jewish school in Israel. We're an independent country. We can run our own affairs. Let us make our own schools. Now, of course, this deeply misunderstands the fact that a significant amount of the money given to Israel is for the benefit of those who give it. That's frequently the case with charity. Charity is frequently to the benefit of the donor rather than the recipient only. And it's important that Jews retain a sense of a stake in the state of Israel and the land of Israel. But it is probably not true that the money that Jews gave to Israel, except in a very specific moment, say, for example, in the Six-Day War, the amount of blood sent over or the amount of money that enabled them to keep hospitals running or something like that. But in a general way, the vast majority of Israel can cope for itself. At the same time, it plays into the rather arrogant Israeli instinct that why don't you just leave us to get on with it? We know exactly what we're doing. It's our business. Don't interfere. And that idea that we don't need anybody is a destructive position, I would say, for Israelis. Not because they can't possibly cope on their own, but because there is some virtue in cultivating a habit of mind that says, I need to take others into account. Furthermore, there would be a great habit of mind, if only they could do it, if Israel cared about planning for the future rather than just getting by for the time being. And Israel has always been a getting by for the time being sort of place. And that's very unhelpful too. And I think diaspora voices, because we've got a longer history, should be able, if there were a proper dialogue, and there's a dialogue of the deaf, both sides shouting at each other, but if there were a proper dialogue, I think diaspora jury could give Israel perspective, and Israel could give diaspora jury pride. And those two things would be a great exchange. But it's not mostly happening. Now, I'm seeing some more questions here. Why haven't Arab countries ever absorbed the refugees or their descendants? Right. I think there are two things going on here. Let's be clear about this, guys. And if I achieve nothing else by the end of this program, I hope I will have made you care deeply, desperately for the Palestinians. Right? The Palestinians are amongst the most unfortunate people on the planet. They have been ill served by their friends and allies, let alone anybody else. They have been ill served by their friends and allies, and especially their leaders, for decades. Right? The insistence that we are not going to try and find a way forward, but we are instead going to stand, is frequently the Palestinians being used, the ordinary Palestinian in the street, being used as a pawn for somebody else's political aspirations. They've never had a proper say. They've never had a proper go. They've never been taken seriously by anybody. They've been pushed and shoved to the side all the time. I've got a perfect example of it. This is a small example. We just had a general election here in Britain. By the way, guys, what are you doing in America? Here in Britain, the British Prime Minister announced, Rishi Sunak, because we can have a Hindu Prime Minister without any difficulties. Rishi Sunak announced there will be a general election in 6 weeks' time. And everybody said, what, 6 weeks? Oh, no, that's going to drag it out for ages. But anyway, 6 weeks later, there was a general election. People voted, right? And the results came through that night. And by 3 o'clock in the morning, it was clear that Rishi Sunak had lost. And he phoned up Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, and said, I concede defeat. You are now the leader of the House of Commons. Right, you've still got to wait for the king to invite him to form a government, but nevertheless, you are now the leader of the House of Commons. Right? That morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, that same morning of the night of the election, the removal vans turn up outside number 10 Downing Street, and they take Rishi Sunak's furniture out, and they install Keir Starmer's furniture. And at 10 o'clock that morning, Keir Starmer walks with his wife down Downing Street into number 10 and takes up residence. That's how long it takes here, guys. I don't know what you're up to. It's such fun to watch, but I can't imagine it's fun to be in. But anyway, that's your thing. So Arab countries, why didn't they absorb the refugees? Well, because I think they wanted to keep them there, because the Arab countries never wanted Israel to be there, and therefore wanted the refugees to stand as an accusation, as a challenge to the illegitimacy of Israel and a condemnation of it. Now, there have been various attempts on the part of the opponents of Israel to besmirch its reputation. The existence of refugees, of course, is the first thing. Look what they did. If they absorbed these people, I wouldn't be able to say, look what they did. That's the first thing. During the 60s and 70s, especially as Holocaust denial started to pick up, you got more and more reference to the 6 million Palestinian refugees. Now, of course, there weren't 6 million. There were perhaps 600, 700,000 who left what became Israel, the state of Israel, and found themselves in these camps. But of course, 4 generations on, you could argue there were 6 million. And this was an attempt to undermine the ownership of the number 6 million by Israel, because it was perceived quite intelligently by the enemies of Israel, and that's not least the USSR at this point, that the moral claim of the 6 million made it very difficult for anybody to argue against Israel. So if you could undermine the 6 million and muddy what it meant, that would be a good thing. So they tried that. It didn't really work. But then in the 1970s, they moved in with this United Nations motion of Zionism is racism. So if you can't undermine the 6 million, then perhaps you could undermine the claim that the Jews were the victims of racism. Instead, you argue that the perpetrators of racism. Right? And that motion was passed in the United Nations. Of course, there's an automatic majority amongst the former colonies who all object to colonial rule. And having been told that that's what's going on in Israel, that Arabs are being discriminated against by Jews who are Europeans. Of course, nobody knows about the Middle Eastern Jews in Israel, not least because Israel spent so long ignoring them that they forgot to make any point about them. But nevertheless, that suggestion that Zionism is racism was another attempt to kind of chop the legs off the moral rectitude or justification for the state of Israel. More recently, we've seen two other accusations rise, which have been in the air, but now they've really become weaponized. The first is that Israel is an apartheid state. We all know what apartheid, I hope we all know what apartheid was. It was a formally structured legal system whereby people were categorized according to race, and according to their race, they could or could not access aspects of the state's provision. So if you were considered black, you could not go to this university. If you were considered white, then you could only live in this area. If you were considered coloured, then you could have those jobs, but not those jobs, and so on. That was apartheid. The accusation that Israel is an apartheid state is clearly, self-evidently, complete tosh, to use a technical term. But nevertheless, it kind of sounds feasible, because doesn't Israel discriminate against Arabs? Right? And certainly there's a case to be made that Arabs in the state of Israel, Arab citizens, and 20% of Israel's citizenry is not Jewish, is neglected, hasn't had as good a deal. Its schools are not as good. Its opportunities are not as good. And although at some level Israel has simply respected the right of Arabs to have their own schools in Arabic and that sort of thing, it's also consequentially disadvantages Arabs because if they've not been in the army, for example, it's harder to get a good job or know the right people or whatever it might be. So there is a case to be made that Arabs in Israel are discriminated against, but it would be like calling America an apartheid state, because in some parts of America, black people definitely have a worse deal than white people. But that doesn't mean to say that that America is an apartheid state. It might just be being discriminatory against some of its citizens, and that's probably true in every country in the world where there is any kind of diversity at all. And the other accusation is genocide. And this again, you see, is the use of the term genocide was coined to talk about the Jews. All right, the Holocaust was the first thing called the genocide. The word was invented to describe the Holocaust. All right, the word didn't exist before the 1940s. It came into being at the Nuremberg trials, and therefore to be able to claim that genocide doesn't, as it were, belong to the Jews, but is perpetrated by the Jews, is part of the same program of trying to deny the ethical legitimacy of the existence of the state of Israel. These are the existential, intellectual, conceptual battles that are going on side by side with the physical battles of the wars and the bombs and the missiles. And I think it must be said that Israel is winning the bombs and the missiles, generally speaking, but it is losing hand over fist as far as the intellectual and conceptual battles are concerned. It doesn't seem to have a clue, or it's so impatient with it that it doesn't seem to want to deal with it at all. And so keeping the Palestinians, to conclude on that, keeping the Palestinians in the camps is all of a piece with that. And how tough for those Palestinians, really. I mean, they're a resilient bunch of people. They're a smart lot of folk. They're amongst the most educated Arabs in the whole Middle East, especially those who have left and gone to live in America or wherever else. They're an aspiring group. But notice The Israelis thought that if you gave Palestinians employment and they had a kind of financial stake in keeping the peace, then they would never rebel against Israel. But that's just stupid, because Israel is full of people who have given up financial security and made stupid financial decisions in order to go and live in Israel. That is, they care more about an independent state of Israel and living in it and being a citizen of a Jewish state than they care about, perfect financial, having the right job stuff. How is it that Israel does not understand that the same thing might be true of Palestinians? But instead they think, yeah, but they're Palestinians, just give them a job and that will keep them quiet. And it clearly hasn't and doesn't. I see a message from Kenneth Miller. The Arabs still have the mentality of one, the family, two, the village, three, the clan, the country, the religion. Well, yeah, and that's about people, isn't it? I mean, I'm not sure that isn't true about Jews as well. So maybe all we're saying is that Arabs, like Jews, are people. The vast majority of Israeli pharmacists are Arabs. Well, isn't that interesting? I mean, I didn't know that that's the case, but if it is, Israelis are behaving like they're not afraid of being poisoned by Arabs, right? They're going into these places and go, give me a tablet, I'm going to take it. You know what's in it, I haven't got a clue, right? That's what I was saying before about Muslims in America or in the world. We behave like they are not going to kill us. And mostly, thank God, that's true. Because they're decent folk, right? It's very important to not stereotype as an enemy because people happen to have the same label as people who are enemies. Right. Good. Somebody's responded, say, you call incarceration without trial, checkpoints, etc., not apartheid? Yes, I call it not apartheid. Forgive me. The challenge is right. That is, there is dreadful inequality in what I'm going to, for this bit of the discussion, call the occupied territories. The occupied territories are under military rule or predominant civilian rule, but not under parliamentary, Knesset, democratic, open voting norms. The occupied territories are disputed territories, and they do not have proper, what you and I might call normal democratic rule of law type structures. They can be challenged, but they're certainly not the same as in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel proper. And that, of course, accentuates, therefore, regardless of what Israel may choose to say about these bits of land or those bits of land are really part of the state of Israel, in the way in which the Golan Heights have directly been brought under Israeli rule. They have been annexed and therefore are now part of the state of Israel as far as the state of Israel is concerned. The same thing goes for East Jerusalem. The West Bank or Gaza before and so on were not part of the state of Israel. They were not annexed, and therefore they were an anomalous piece of land. However, and this is not a defensive statement because I accept that the Palestinians living in those places are having a very tough time of it. I mean, not the worst place in the world, I would say, but a very tough time of it. They are facing checkpoints. They are facing detention without trial, or certainly without open trials as we would expect them. So all kinds of normal democratic procedures do not apply in the West Bank and did not apply in Gaza while Israel was inside Gaza. But it's not apartheid, because apartheid is how a government treats its own citizens. And at this point, the people in these places are in disputed status. And it's important to remember that when people say, for example, that Israel should at the very least give the West Bank back to the Palestinians, right? There is no back in this game, because this territory was never part of anything in international law since the British Mandate. That is, you could say it was supposed to be part of the Palestinian state, or the Arab state as it was called in the partition plan. But the Arabs formally rejected the partition plan. They said, in effect, we do not want this land as a country for us. We want the whole thing. We're not accepting this deal. And therefore, when Israel says that its settlements are not illegal, because in most cases, settling land which has been conquered in war is illegal, right, by international law. But Israel can make a case that this land has not been conquered in war from another sovereign state. This land was disputed. It was only being held by Jordan, held by Egypt. This land was disputed, and therefore Israel has as much right to, put a settlement in it as Jordan had a right to put a settlement in it, or the Palestinians had a right to put a settlement in it. It's a slightly tricksy argument, but it is not a completely ridiculous one. So just to mention that.
We've Clive.
Yeah, we've overshot time, folks.
We've
There's
reached
so much.
time. I want to maybe end with one question. If you had to direct people in how to continue, or what you would consider a good continuation of learning around these issues and educating ourselves more, what would your recommendations be?
Well, I mentioned right at the beginning the book. Let me see if I can get it down straight away. It's where's it gone? Yeah. Like Dreamers by Yossi Klein Halevi. Like Dreamers, it's called The Story of the Israeli Paratroopers Who Reunited Jerusalem and Divided a Nation. Right? This is about a group of paratroopers who fought their way into Jerusalem in 1967. They were heroes, without doubt, of that battle. And then the members of that spun off in all kinds of directions. They became the leaders of the religious Gush Etzion bloc. They became the leaders of revolutionary left-wing secular people. They went back to kibbutzim, they went into business, and so on. They were a really remarkable bunch of people, and this tells the story of how these people created the current political environment. The one thing that Klein Halevi does not talk about, of course, is the spin to the right. I mean the extreme spin to the right, as manifest by people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Until this last parliament, or Knesset, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir would not have been able to get into the Knesset because there was a consensus across the political parties that the Kahana kind of position, the Kach position, is a strong, I would say unashamedly racist position against the Palestinians and Arabs in general, and has no patience with niceties like human rights and things of this sort. It sees Israel to be caught in an existential battle in which preoccupations like that are a luxury you can't afford, and furthermore is driven by a conviction of God on our side and the right and responsibility of Jews to hold and fight for the entire land of Israel. Indeed, they'd like to spread the borders still further. Those characters, as I say, Kahana and the Kach movement, were excluded from Israeli politics on the basis that they were a step too far. And you in America have some political positions which would also be excluded from general politics as being a step too far. On this last election, Netanyahu encouraged the two parties of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to come together in an alliance so that they could beat the limit of the proportional representation system. The proportional representation system creates lots and lots of tiny parties, as you know. makes it really difficult to create a government that anybody can recognize, because you vote for this party and somebody else votes for that party, but those parties' policies never make it into government because the various parties have to compromise and haggle in order to create a government. Unlike if you vote Republican, then you kind of know what you're going to get from the Republicans if they win, right? But you can't do that in Israel in the same way. But Netanyahu was trying to find a right-wing alliance that could give him a majority. And he knew that Smotrich on his own and Ben-Gvir on his own would not get the above the threshold to get seats in the Knesset. So although it's rigidly proportional in terms of representation, if you don't get, I think the number is 5%, but it doesn't matter. If you don't get, say, 5% of the vote, then you don't get any representation. This is an attempt to try and ensure that you don't have more than 20 parties in the Knesset, right? You've got to get at least 5% of the vote to get in at all. So he encouraged the two of them to get together. And that way they did get over the threshold. And that way they got into the Knesset with their people. And you have this really, really intensely right-wing group that I think the majority of diaspora Jews would be quite surprised to find in a Jewish parliament. The recent disputes, for example, that we've just heard from Ben-Gvir, encouraging his supporters to go and confront the Israeli army for arresting some soldiers who have been accused of torturing Palestinian Hamas prisoners. Now, whether or not you think that they did or they didn't torture them, the idea of arresting them and putting them on trial because they've been accused of torturing them seems to me to be an entirely reasonable thing to do, right? You may want to treat them leniently, you may want to find justification for them torturing, you may want to find that they didn't torture them, right? But at the very least, if the accusation is made, it seems to me a civilized country ought to put on trial people who are accused of torturing. Ben-Gvir says there is no justification for this, right? You do whatever the hell you want to do, and anyway, these people don't deserve things like rights of that sort. That's in the parliament, and he encouraged his supporters, and not least members of the Knesset, went and broke into an Israeli army base in order to try and prevent the arrest of these soldiers. So that sort of thing is beyond the usual pale and is starting to manifest itself in Israel, as you saw in America with the Capitol riots, the January 6th Capitol riots. Now, again, I don't know what your individual views are on that. You might have felt that it was essential given the injustice of stealing the election, right? But nevertheless, you must recognize that a democracy can't tolerate too many of those events too often before the norms break down irretrievably. And that's where I think we seem to be.
Clive, thank you very much. You brought us all the way to the headlines in Israel yesterday and today, sadly, quite terrifying ones. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I will mention that I'll add in the follow-up email a lot of amazing CSP programs that we have that can expand on the things that we heard today, from Palestinian perspectives through the makeup of Israeli society and its different denominations and ethnicities, and all the way to today, so that you can continue your learning. Clive, thank you very, very much for taking us through this journey, this three-part journey, which is definitely a hard terrain to cross. And thank you for...
Carol, can I say, I recommended this book, and I recommend it not least because it ranges so widely across the spectrum. But when you're doing your reading, first off, if you read something that you find yourself thinking, yeah, that's absolutely, yeah, of course, absolutely, then go read something else, because stuff that you agree with is not telling you everything, right? Find something that you think is going to be absolute anathema and read that too, and try and read it with a level of respect. Try and stand in the shoes of the person writing it and think, why are they saying, how could they think that they can say this? That doesn't mean say you have to agree with them, but read it and see two sides. If you can't see two sides, you're not looking properly. There are two sides.
Clive, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for being here. Have a good continuation of your day, afternoon, or your evening, wherever you are.
Bye-bye all. Thank you. Enjoy your pint mugs.